Okay, welcome back, folks. In our last video, I told you about some of the basics of structuralism by talking about Ferdinand de Saussure, and then I suggested that one of our deeper look readings might be a good one to read by Roland Barthes about professional wrestling. What I want to do in this video is see how 4.Lévi-Strauss applied structuralism to culture through anthropology. But I'm actually going to start this video with a puzzling statement from 4.Lévi-Strauss. And really, that's where any good academic work should begin, with a puzzle. And in that spirit, here's something Lévi-Strauss says. It's going to appear in front of you on your screen, as all of our important quotes this semester are going to. Instead of contrasting magic and science, it is better to compare them as two parallel modes of acquiring knowledge. Their theoretical and practical results differ in value, for it is true that science is more successful in magic from this point of view, although magic foreshadows science in that it is sometimes also successful. Both science and magic, however, require the same sort of mental operations, and they differ not so much in kind as in the different types of phenomena to which they are applied. Now, this really is a puzzle. What's he trying to say here? Magic and science are parallel modes? That seems to imply they travel side by side, but heading in the same direction. And yet, one is more successful than the other? Successful at what? Producing results? What results? Well, what I want to do in this video is explain why this argument that Lévi-Strauss makes is interpreted as structuralist. And notice precisely what I just said there. I'm not saying because he's a structuralist, this passage must mean X. Instead, once we see what this passage means in this lecture, we'll see that he's really talking about the deep structures of human language and therefore about human culture. Okay, so here's another pointer about how written argument is going to go in this class. We want to actually be able to understand the text before applying some label, some ism to it. So if I interpreted him in the light of somebody saying to me that he was a structuralist, I might actually miss things within the text that don't actually fit with that theory of structuralism. And that should be intuitive, I think. If someone told me Princeton students come from families in the top 20% of the income bracket, would I be justified in concluding that you were from a family in the top 20% of the income bracket? Well, no, you might be. And maybe I'd be justified in thinking that the odds are that you are. 70+% of students at Princeton come from the top 20% of income brackets. But the generalization about income levels of Princeton students, of course, doesn't apply to all of them. That's just obvious, right? And this, of course, is also true about textual arguments in political theory. Just because some professor tells you this thinker is a structuralist and structuralism means that, that doesn't mean that each and every part of that thinker is going to fit with that generalization. Look, no one ever sat down at a desk and said to themselves, I think I'll be a structuralist. And therefore, each and everything that I think, each and every argument that I make from here on out in my life will be structuralist. No, of course they don't do it that way. Everyone sees lots of conflicting evidence in the world, and they just try to make sense of that evidence using a theory. So in that sense, someone can endorse an ism of some sort because it helps them to make some sense of the world, but when they see conflicts and problems between the data of the world and what their ism is telling them, the evidence doesn't match up with the theory, that is where you actually learn the most about them. So throughout this semester, I always want you to notice the way in which the texts that you're directly reading don't match up with the interpretations that I'm giving of them in these videos. In fact, I want you to actually note those sort of mismatches in our hypothesis document by using the tag puzzle for them. Because like I said, the puzzles are going to be the most interesting parts of the text. And it's with those puzzles that you'll get a start on a final project. In fact, if everybody marks those documents with tags for puzzle, you can all actually work with each other to figure out the puzzling parts of the text and start to write about them at the end of the semester. Okay, so Lévi-Strauss saw a puzzle. Structuralists tended to think that there was no worse or better culture, as I've said, but you did have people in Western cultures using science to invent medicine that was increasing lifespans, while in some other cultures, people engaged in magic healing that was not. So he's stuck with a bit of a contradiction in his theory. Even he thinks, can a structuralist really maintain that belief about cultures that neither one of them is better, that neither one of them is better even at life-saving? Well, he wants to say that both magic and science are simply structures of thought and show that they really actually exhibit the same types of human reasoning, but he has to kind of admit that there seem to be qualitative differences between them of other sorts. The evidence of the world, in other words, defies easy theoretical explanation. So he's not going to say, pay no attention to that puzzle. I can still explain the world with simple structuralism. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to complicate the theory itself. He's going to deepen his structuralist argument and say that the thing you really want to know is the similarities between these cultures, not the differences. As he said in that opening quote, science and magic are the same sort of mental operations, and those are at work in the two in the same way. How? Well, you can see him actually building up bit by bit to that initial quote that we looked at from page 9 throughout his text, building concepts so that he can then say what he says on page 9. So I also want to take 10 seconds to say to you that the English translation of the title of what you read, The Savage Mind, in French is La Pensée Sauvage. Pardon my French. In French, it could equally well refer to wild flowers as to a natural mind or something like that. So in French, it's a play on words. Translated into English, Lévi-Strauss still approved of it, but he's obviously not trying to say other cultures are savages. Quite the opposite, as you'll see. So from the start, you see Lévi-Strauss's focus on language, just like Saussure. He makes the assertion that we can't call the speakers of other languages better or worse intellectually because they have fewer or more words to categorize things. There are some people out there, he says, who say that these others are worse if they have fewer words because they're only labeling things that are of everyday use. The attitude here is something like, oh, those backwards people, they never raise their minds above their daily needs. And then he says, paradoxically, there are other people who say that they're worse if they have more words, because labeling everything in minute detail rather than grouping things into broad intellectual categories is supposed to be somehow worse. Lévi-Strauss argues on page 2 that the paradox between these two things sort of points to a truth. Every language is going to have a balance between being complex enough to differentiate things that are of use to people and organized enough to group things together for convenience. Every language is going to have that structure, he says. We all label things that are of use to us, and we all create larger concepts and categories. This is a point we'll get back to when we study Rorty in a couple of weeks. So why is this important? Well, it's because he thinks that the urge to create both science and magic stem from this source, the urge to categorize knowledge and group useful things together. He thinks this urge has led some cultures to use what Westerners would call magical understandings of natural items to try to do exactly what Westerners are trying to do with science, the same thing. So on page 6, he lists off some of the sophisticated things that cultures try to do using what they find in nature. So for instance, he talks about a culture that swallows spiders and worms to cure sterility. The idea here is that because they are alive and wriggling, while sterility is a certain sort of dormancy, they will impart their aliveness, their wriggling, their energy to the person who swallows them. There are others out there that he points to that consume other things that seem, within that group's language, to have the properties that will cure somebody's health problems. So in this sense, he says, it might actually make sense that you'd try to use a woodpecker's beak to cure a toothache because, well, they must be awfully darn durable if the birds are banging against trees all day with them and not breaking them. So quote science and quote magic, whatever it is, it's all simply categorizing knowledge. As he says on page 6, The real question is not whether the touch of a woodpecker's beak does in fact cure toothache. It is rather whether there is a point of view from which a woodpecker's beak and a man's tooth can be seen as going together. Both science and magic are founded on what he calls the demand for order. In fact, he says on page 7 that magic is in fact more scientific than science because it seeks explanations for everything in the world, all of which has to fit together within some sort of explanatory scheme. Science in the West only seeks to explain material causes of health and well-being, let's say, but it doesn't try to explain literature or what makes a Monet painting beautiful. Magic does. So these supposedly backward cultures that use magic have much more sophisticated ordering schemes within their language, using much more complete groupings, much more useful comparisons, we might say. But with this, he's not saying that they're better either. He just wants to say that anyone who calls them worse is wrong. And he can explain, he believes, where that judgment that they are worse comes from within the languages of Westerners. He would explain the Westerners' belief that science and magic are opposites, with one being better than the other, as a binary, he says. That is in fact one of the deep structures of language, binary oppositions. He thinks that languages, all of them, all present us with these binaries, and those are the things that create meaning. So in the West, science versus magic both makes Harry Potter meaningful because magic is mystical and imaginary, making Harry Potter what it is, and it makes going to the doctor meaningful because Westerners are told from the time they're 2 years old that science cures people and magic doesn't. So here's the important part. For Lévi-Strauss, there is no necessary connection between the way the binary is presented to you in your culture and the facts of the world. Like Saussure said, there's no necessary connection between the words you use as signifiers and some object out there. Lévi-Strauss extends this to the binaries that we use to give meaning to our choices. That's why his book tries to present evidence from other cultures that Westerners think are backwards and magical in their thought, and suggest, his book does, they are really structurally just the same as Westerners. They are trying to create ordered meanings out of their world, and they have their own binaries and oppositions. Think here of the wriggling worm opposing sterility, a binary opposition, and the woodpecker's beak, on the other hand, being grouped with durable things, not weak things, just another use of a binary, he says. Tyler, the first anthropologist we looked at, said these other cultures are at an earlier stage of development. Lévi-Strauss seems to throw some shade at Tyler on page 8 when he says, "One deprives oneself of all means of understanding magical thought if one tries to reduce it to a moment or stage in technical and scientific evolution." So we arrive back now at the puzzle that we opened this little video with, but now we understand better how Lévi-Strauss arrived at the conclusion that the important thing to know about science and magic is not that one of them is more successful in extending lives or something like that. That's just the binary that Westerners use. He says the important thing to know is that both of them exhibit the same structure of knowledge. So I'm going to show you this quote one more time so we can take it up in Text Lab and see how we can explain this quote in terms of Lévi-Strauss language and see how much of it we might think of as structuralist or how much of it we might think of as still puzzling. Instead of contrasting magic and science, it is better to compare them as two parallel modes of acquiring knowledge. Their theoretical and practical results differ in value, for it is true that science is more successful than magic from this point of view, although magic foreshadows science in that it is sometimes also successful. Both science and magic, however, require the same sort of mental operations, and they differ not so much in kind as in the different types of phenomena to which they are applied. I look forward to discussing that with you in our Text Lab. I'll see you then.